Hiya, how's it going? Welcome to BornOptimistic. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm joined by Claire Hennessy. Claire, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, yeah.
And Claire is an author, an educator, teaching writing, and also works for a publisher. I'm very interested in finding out all about that mix. But Claire, the first question, my traditional first question is, where do you sit on the optimism spectrum?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I was kind of thinking about it before coming over here, because I would probably consider myself more of a pessimist. You know, that's where I'm at in my head. And then I kind of look at how my life actually is and how, I have kind of kept up writing, which is such a kind of unpredictable and mad world with kind of no guarantees whatsoever, and that I have done that. And I mean, I've been writing for nearly 20 years now, so maybe I'm more optimistic than I think.
So it's not something you even think about normally. I'm kind of forcing you to think about it, or is it something you're aware of?
I don't. I think when I do think about it, I would consider myself more of a kind of, a pessimist, sort of like look on the, expect the worst. But actually, I don't know, maybe that's just, a kind of like melodramatic writer image that I have in my head, like sort of wearing all black and writing like tormented poetry with really bad metaphors. And, whereas in reality, I'm there going, oh, yay, lovely writing. Isn't it great?
Yeah, but because, if you're teaching people to write, one of the things, I'm changing my own order here, but one of the things that struck me when I was looking at the website, your school's name again?
The Big Smoke Writing Factory, yeah.
When I was looking at it, I was looking at the website and looking at all the different courses you offer and kind of going, I was wondering what the motivation is of the people you teach to write. Why do they want to get better at writing or learn how to write? Is it for fun? Is it for career? Like, what do you come across?
It really depends on the level of class that you have. So if you're teaching a beginner's class, people have all kinds of different reasons for being there. Sometimes a spouse has bought them a gift certificate to get them out of the house. Sometimes, they like doing evening classes. It's a way of kind of meeting people. But I think it's to give themselves the confidence really to write and to take it seriously, because it's much easier to kind of give yourself permission to take the time out of the rest of your life and write if you're doing it for a class and if you're kind of accountable to other people. So I think that's really sort of a big thing. You hear so many people talking about how they used to write when they were younger and then they haven't, and the older you get, the harder it becomes to justify, because it's not something that has a formal structure, so if you're, say you're interested in drama, well, sort of you might join, sort of an amateur theatre, sort of thing in your local area, or if you're playing sports, sort of you join a team, and there's very definite times when you have to do that, and you're accountable to other people. And with writing, it's individual and it's portable, so you kind of theoretically you can do it anywhere and you can do it at any time, which in practice means that it's the thing that you put off until you realise it's been maybe 5 years and that book that you've always meant to write is still the thing that you're talking about and talking about at parties as well. There was a period in my 20s where every so often I'd run into the same guy at sort of different gatherings, and he was every time he would tell me about the book that he was going to write, and it's like, dude, I don't care. Like, write the thing, stop talking about it. Actually sort of make it happen. And I think, sort of a writing class is, for people, it can be sort of that first step. Then you have people that maybe they've been writing for a while and then they want to sort of improve in a particular area, or they maybe sort of just want to try out something new. So sometimes I would teach kind of specialist classes in kind of children's and young adult fiction, where people are maybe working very seriously on on a project, or you might do kind of like a publishing seminar, which is demystifying the publishing process, which I think is really important. Like for me, I just think that like making that information as available as possible is really important.
Well, it's kind of punk. I was looking at that on your. It's like when punk came out and the sleeves of the records would tell people how to make records.
Yeah.
On your website, there's a lot of that, like literally breaking down the barriers. But what do you think is the point of writing?
Oh, to communicate. To communicate and to tell stories, which are so much part of our lives anyway. Like we, as humans, I think we turn things into narratives. Like if we've had a bad day at the office, or if where you really see it is when people tell the story of their romantic relationships. It's like they have turned it into a narrative. They've turned it into the story that they can tell, and they have kind of selected details and they have left other ones out. So yeah, I think it's a very natural impulse, and you see it like when I sometimes go into schools to do workshops, and if the kids are sort of like 8 or 9 or 10, and you just sort of like give them sort of a tiny prompt and get them started in writing a story, they're like so eager to do it. Like it's a really natural thing, and it kind of gets stamped out of us by the educational system in a lot of ways. So that's my kind of sort of general answer. And then I think also for me personally, it's kind of what keeps me sane-ish. And when I'm not doing it, because there is something very satisfying about, what you were doing is you were making a thing, you were building a thing out of words, and that there's something very satisfying in doing that. So yeah, I'm happier when I am writing.
So you said you've been a writer for 20 years and you're in your early 30s.
Yes, I am a recovering child prodigy. So my first book was published just before I turned 14, which is makes for like really interesting like English classes at school. It's like.
Were you precocious?
But actually, because I work with teenagers and I see the kind of stuff that they write, like it's brilliant, so I don't think that there's anything that, I don't think it's necessarily that you have to be sort of like, extraordinarily talented. Like I think that there are very many teenagers out there who are capable of writing very well.
If your first book was published when you were 14, obviously there's a backstory going back before that. So what brought you to writing? Like, who were the influencers? What were the events? What, your story, the pre-14 bit? Yeah,
I was always reading. And I was always writing, and the two are very kind of connected for me. So I don't ever remember there being this like one moment where I thought, I'm gonna sit down and write a book. It was just something that I was always doing. But a few things definitely helped, and one was sort of reading a huge amount, and I started reading young, and I was I always had my nose in a book, to the point where I was very I was quite antisocial. It was like at the dinner table reading a book. It's like you can't do that. And we always had books in the house as well. Like it was. It wasn't kind of considered sort of a strange thing to be, books would be the things that like my parents gave each other at Christmas, for example, so I think that just kind of does create a culture where, reading for leisure is normalized. I think that's really important. And then learning to type. Do you remember Mavis Beacon teaches typing? So I learned how to type quite early on. Maybe I was 8 or 9 or something, but like that capacity then to be able to kind of use the computer and not be sort of relying on handwriting, I think really made a difference as well, because it's it's easier.
So you're in your teens at home, typing away on a computer, and then you have to go into a school and write longhand in your exams?
Yeah.
Did that affect your grades or?
No, not really. But I think that's how it is for, sort of for teenagers today and for young people today, that so much of communication happens sort of, with, their phones and online, and, sort of that's what they get used to. And then you're put into this very weird situation where it's like, okay, handwrite for, 3.5 hours there. It does strike me as bizarre.
Yeah, it's kind of barbaric almost that it's like retrofitting your talents.
Yeah.
It like, here's something you can do really well, but you're not allowed to use it for this purpose, which will kind of define a good chunk of the next 30, 40 years of your life. I mean. So when your book came out and you're 14, can you remember like what your expectations were for your life at that point?
It's really. I think it's interesting that I was very clear about how writing is very precarious and how there isn't nearly as much money in it as people think there is. So in my head it was like, okay, this is going to be the thing that I do and it's going to be the thing that I pursue, but also what's my day job going to be?
And what did you figure out age 13 or 14?
Oh, I was like, okay, let's get thinking about day jobs, and actually, the one thing that I said I would never do would be teach, because my mother is a teacher, and therefore, oh my God, how could I? And I still think like if I was a teacher in mainstream education, it would probably wreck my head. Whereas, getting to do kind of evening classes or, summer programs or, go into a school for maybe sort of a day or a week and kind of, do that kind of, stuff that is kind of slightly outside the curriculum is much more fun, I think. And it's good for them as well. Like it's always good to sort of, to know that there are adults out there who are are creative and are kind of making things, because I do think there does seem to be this sense that it is so maybe childish in some way to sort of to get such joy out of playing, essentially, so yeah.
And do you think creativity is something we're born with and we unlearn, or it's something we learn, or something everyone has in them?
I think we all have sort of creativity within us. Absolutely. We are, it's how we work as humans. I do think that, people, there's definitely sort of people that are kind of more obviously creative than others. There's people who, have nurtured their creativity or have had it nurtured. And then there's people who have had it kind of, flattened. But I do think we are all capable of kind of making things up, like the example that I always use is like we all daydream, but like the thing I always think is like, if you've ever kind of watched a TV program or a film and you've like speculated on like what's going to happen next, that's creativity, and like problem solving, is a very sort of creative thing, so yeah, I think we all are. And I think as well, like we have kind of certain ideas about creativity that like it's only it's only a thing that's kind of leads to sort of to art, but I mean it's also something that it applies to all kinds of different fields, to business and to science and other disciplines that I'm aware of but like would never go near.
So you haven't applied your teaching techniques to business?
Oh God, no. I mean, I don't. Because I co-run. So I co-run a creative writing school, and also I also co-edit a literary journal. So on kind of like various official forms, like my occupation is listed as businesswoman, and that terrifies me. Like, no, I'm just a lovely writer person who teaches classes sometimes, and yeah.
You're not like selling out to the man?
Yeah, oh no way, man.
Because, I mean, you've got get up and go, you're a self-starter, you're ingenious, you create products for the world. What's the difference between you and a business person?
Oh, a soul. Yeah, I think when you're, I think writing is probably closer to like social entrepreneurship in many ways, in that you're not necessarily thinking about what's going to make the most money, but you're thinking about what, sort of what is something that you can do, something that you can offer. So I mean, there are certainly people that treat writing as, in a very sort of business way, and are kind of looking at, okay, well, like what is like sort of the bestseller formula, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, but it's not the way I approach it.
And are you confronted with students sometimes who have a particular approach? I mean, what's the span of, because I'm so curious about you, because you see the craft of writing from so many different angles. You are a writer, you are a publisher, an editor, and you're a teacher. So it's almost like poacher and gamekeeper and landowner or something. I'm not sure.
Not a landowner, no.
But you're covering all these bases, which for me, it must give you a very interesting perspective. Do you coach yourself, for example, when you're writing?
No, I should. Yeah. I think one of the things about teaching is that you are kind of constantly reminded of the kind of the basics, if you like, and I think that's really important. And it does mean that you are then far less likely to, go into sort of melodramatic writer mode and go, oh, I cannot write today, my soul is weary of this world, and, the words are just not coming. And it's like, oh, for God's sake, like, write something, like, what is this writer's block? What? Take a break, or write something even if it's absolute nonsense. Like this idea of oh, I can't possibly write anything. It's like, what are you like? We're not it's not rocket science. Do you know what I mean? It's like, write a sentence, might be like the cat sat on the mat, but it's a sentence. I mean, not that I have any strong feelings on this, of course.
So it's fair to say that you see writing as an enjoyable process, and you've no time for tortured artists.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely sort of struggles and difficulties, particularly when you're working on kind of on a big project. But I think you do have to kind of remind yourself of why you're doing it, and kind of keep it kind of in perspective as well.
So who were the authors that really got you to fall in love with reading and then writing? Who were they?
Oh God. I mean, I don't even remember. It was probably the Spot books, or there wasn't. I don't remember ever having this revelation where it was like, oh my God, books can be amazing. It was kind of like a given. But I mean, when I was younger, I suppose I loved Enid Blyton. I still love Enid Blyton, and Roald Dahl, Anne M. Martin, who wrote The Babysitter's Club, as a sort of hero. And I read. You might remember this, the Mandy and Judy comics. Yeah, the Four Marys and, all that kind of stuff. So I read loads of those.
I was reading Victor and Warlord while you were reading Mandy and Judy, I suspect.
Quite possibly, yes. Highly gendered is the world of children's comics, yeah.
So you had published your first book by the age that most people read Catcher in the Rye. Yeah.
Yes, and I hadn't read Catcher in the Rye at the time, which is so terrible of me. Yeah.
So did you go through that kind of angsty teen? It's kind of so I believe that most people do pretty much the same things in their life, and sometimes we can mess with the order. So it's like your career kind of started before you went through that late teenage angsty bit.
Oh, well, no, see, the young people today are very, sort of they get their teenage angst started much earlier, so...
Tell me about it.
Yeah, so I think definitely I was already an angsty teenager by that stage. And then I was, slightly kind of more copped on in my late teens, I think.
You think?
Slightly. I said slightly.
So, who are your books for, the books you write?
I mean, they're marketed as young adult fiction, which is a really interesting category at the moment, because even though it's very much marketed towards teenagers, they are often read by adults and purchased by adults. So I don't think too much about the audience when I write necessarily. I think more about the characters that I'm writing about, and sort of getting into their heads and sort of conveying their kind of emotional experiences with, hopefully with authenticity and humour. And, I think in that respect, they are for kind of anyone, but because I'm writing about teenagers, and I'm writing from a teenage perspective, so there isn't that kind of, sense of having an adult voice looking back and going, oh, I was so foolish then, because that's it's kind of painful.
That's brilliant, because I've always wondered what the distinction was, and you just explained it brilliantly there. So you never sat down and decided, this is the demographic I want to speak to?
No, I think if one was, sort of the soulless business person, you would probably approach it in that way. But, for me, like, I think it's a really interesting field. And I think that adolescence is just, it's a great one for mining for drama, because on the one hand, it is an age where people are kind of having their first encounters in many ways with like the unfairnesses of life and the difficulties of life, but they haven't built up kind of, experiences and kind of perspective. So it's very, very intense. And I mean, that makes for kind of great drama, And I think it's, I think young adult fiction is often very relatable for everyone. I understand why sort of a lot of, sort of adults read it, because it is that like, oh yeah, I've had that experience, and I've had that experience recently or something like it, but it maybe wasn't as intense, or, I have a bit more, experience now, so I have strategies in place for dealing with it. Or, as an adult, I have maybe access to things that I didn't have access to as a teenager, when you're still very much, like forced to be in school with people that are, that you've probably nothing in common with apart from age, and it's a very weird thing. Like, I think schools are just, they are insane places. Like, occasionally I run into somebody who's like, oh yeah, school is great. Like, it's just, I don't understand those people. I think the only appropriate response to sort of like, secondary school is to go, well, at least I survived it.
God, I've never thought about it that way. The only thing you have in common with them is age. That is mind-blowing. Wow.
I feel really deep now. I'm like, ooh, insights.
Wow. I just feel like I have to pause and just kind of take that in. Wow. As they would say, I'm going to stick a pin in that and come back to it. Do you have rules for your writing that you impose on yourself?
No. No. Do you mean, I suppose, like kind of craft-wise rules, or like sort of subject matter, or?
Well, by definition, you have a relationship with the reader. I was going to ask you about the feedback loop with the reader as well, but, do you have so you say you don't think about the reader, but in terms of your relationship with the reader, are there certain tricks you won't play, or things you won't do, or, is it like a relationship you'd have with a friend? Like, I'm very curious, because, making a radio show and podcast can be weird sometimes, because you don't know who's listening and what they think. Now, with a book, the timeline is even more elongated.
Yeah.
So I assume you get feedback from signings and stuff and meeting people. So I'm just curious about that. Like, you're writing for people. Do you have a person in mind? What would you do to them? What would you not do to them? What do you want for them? What do you not want for them? I mean, I literally don't know. I'm stabbing in the dark here.
It's an interesting question, and I really, particularly in, when I'm writing my first draft, I don't think about the reader, because I think if you're worrying about that, it's gonna paralyze you, and you stop. It can make you maybe sort of hold back, or it can make you maybe sort of try to like convey a lesson. Actually, I think probably sort of one of the things that I'm really determined not to do is to get preachy, or to, sort of go, and now did we all get the moral of the story here? Because that's not, it's fiction, it's not non-fiction, it's not a manifesto. Particularly I think with the new book, with Like Other Girls, there were kind of, I think, a couple of friends of mine read one of the chapters and sort of, before, like at the very early stages, and were kind of like underlining bits going, Claire, this is you. This is not your character. This is you having a rant. Take it out. And I was like, yes, thank you. That was, that's actually really helpful. Because, you don't want to write, like, you don't want it to feel like an essay. You don't want it to feel like a polemic. You want it to be a story. And I think, for me, like what I would always hope in a novel, and this is something I've only kind of recently kind of formulated for myself, is that there's a moment where there will be at least one moment where the reader laughs, there will be at least one moment where they cry, and there will be at least one moment where they relate to something really strongly, or kind of think like, oh, me too, I know that feeling. So that sort of moment of kind of recognition. And so those are kind of the three things that I always try to do.
And how do you validate that? How do you know if it's working?
You know, you don't. And I think you have to, you know, because you can't please everybody. You really can't. So, you know, I suppose partly, you know, I would... I worked with a brilliant editor on this, and her feedback was just really useful and absolutely spot on. You know, like everything she said, every kind of suggestion, I was just like, yes, that's perfect, that's great. Which is, you know, just a really nice kind of response to have to editorial feedback, because really what you want to be told is, oh my God, this is perfect, you're a genius. Like really, that's the only thing you want to hear. You know, exactly. And so that was really useful. And I think then you just, you know, you do have to let it go. Like you can't control, like, you know, because everyone is different. You know, there's going to be some people that just, you know, that just even like won't pick it up because they don't like the cover, they don't like the title, or they, you know, whatever. And there's going to be some people that just, you know, so maybe sort of like they read it and they don't like the style, or they, you know, there's something else in there that they don't like, but like you can't control that, you know. So I think, you know, you have to, you know, you have to be sort of, I think, very careful about whose opinions you're really going to value and sort of and take on board, you know. I mean, particularly in an era of, you know, the internet where everyone has an opinion. Everyone has an opinion and everyone feels the need to share it. You know, and I think if you were, like, I think it's all, one of the things that I get students to do sometimes is to think of a book that they read recently and they really loved, and to go read online reviews of that book. And
that's such a cool idea.
It is, because it really, it's a really good way of reminding yourself that, you know, there will be books that you love that someone else has, like, you know, sort of like written a sort of, you know, like 10-page rant about how much they hate, you know. So like, and that's always going to happen. You can't control it. So you just have to kind of do the best that you can, and then move on to making the next thing, you know. Like by the time a book is out, you know, you should be like sort of at least thinking about the next thing, or sort of have started working on it, because there is nothing that you can do like at this, you know, the book's out there, it's done, like, so let it go, move on. And it's the readers, you know, it is now the readers' thing. It is not something that you are working on. Let it go.
And you've no control over who reads it or what they think of it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's really important to remember that. It's really important to remember that, like, you know, there are people, particularly sort of with young adult fiction, because of the sort of implied teenage market, like there will always be kind of faux concerned adults who will go, oh, is this suitable? Is this appropriate? Is this whatever, you know? And like you've no control over it. Like someone reviewed one of my earlier books going, oh, these, you know, there's all this kissing going on. It's disgraceful. And it's like, okay, you were never going to be like, you know, someone who's going to like this book, you know, if you have an issue with like teenagers kissing, you know.
So my memory can be hazy at the best of times, and some things trigger memories, like music will bring me back to particular places. But how do you conserve what it was like to be 14? How do you hang on to that? And how do you disregard the hard lessons you've learned since?
It's a really, you know, that's a really interesting question. And I think one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that, like, you know, teenagers today are living a very different life to to my life, like when I was a teenager, like going on the internet and like sort of, talking about stuff was like this weird thing, and like sort of you were like using kind of usernames and talking about like TV shows. You weren't like uploading pictures of yourself. Good grief, So I do try to take that into account as well. And I suppose, it's a mixture of things. It's kind of thinking about trying to sort of remember your own experiences, but then also just empathy, which I think is so important. It's the thing you really need as a writer, and sort of that sense of like being able to kind of understand and be sympathetic to, and kind of really sort of get where teenagers are coming from.
Well, how do you stay in sync then? Even like I have yet to figure out Snapchat. Like, how do you stay in sync with what your audience is doing? Like how do you research? How do you mine the world for your stories?
I think like working with teenagers and teaching them definitely helps. That you're kind of, not necessarily that you're like grilling them for information or anything like that, but you're just kind of noticing. And I think one of the things that is interesting actually is the number of teenagers who will be like, actually no, I don't use Facebook, because they find actually that sort of whole performative stuff actually quite stressful, and I think sort of anything that's more kind of like private messaging rather than like display seems to be much more of interest. So sort of like thinking about that, and I suppose also I always try to be quite vague about social media when I'm writing as well, because you don't want to be there going like, oh yeah, and then we uploaded our pictures to Bebo, and then we all went on MySpace. And I think even though like certain things have been around for quite a long time, like say Facebook or Twitter, I'm still kind of wary of like sort of actually specifically like naming them. So it'll be like, profile update or, group message. So keeping it kind of... Keep it generic, yeah.
And Gen Z seem to be a very socially aware, caring generation, as much as it's impossible to generalise. But in terms of a reaction to what's come before, it seems like do you think it's a good time to be 14 or a bad time to be 14, or you don't have any choice anyway, I suppose?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, you don't. I think teenagers have often been, sort of like earnest and caring and, and absolutely convinced that they're sort of, the only people who have like, realized that there's a problem with this. And it's like, yeah, okay, I know that like you've like just discovered, social justice, but like, the rest of us have been here for quite a while, we've like, just because we're not talking about it all the time, just because you learned about the environment, 2 minutes ago.
But that's the thing I loved about being a teenager, is that you had so much time to indulge your interests. Whatever it is you were into, you had infinite time. And now I look at my time and my day versus kids, and it's like, that's for me the greatest thing. Whatever it is, whatever rabbit hole you want to go down. And now, like when I was a kid, you had to wait for the monthly magazine to come out to see what bands you were going to like. Everything is there right now.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in some ways, that's, it's a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing in that, because there's no kind of control, there's no kind of editorial process with a lot of this stuff, and I do think that is important. And, for young people to be kind of, I think teaching media literacy is so important. And obviously, you see that with adults as well, who are sort of going, oh my God, if the Sun says this, it must be true. We're like, well, the Daily Mail are, telling me that this is a problem. So, everything causes cancer and will decrease the value of your house.
Laugh at the value of your house, but you've written a lot of books.
Yeah.
I tried to count, but it was difficult because there was stuff you edited and compilations and compendiums, but like 12?
12, yeah. This is book number 12, yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah, but like I was, you can tell that I didn't do enough socializing as a teenager, It's like all the cool kids are there, practicing kissing the boys. I'm on my computer typing.
And how do you think your writing has evolved? I mean, for me, your new book, Like Other Girls, is it fair to say it's your most political book?
Yeah. I was going to say something really like sophisticated and artsy there, but like, yeah. And I mean, I think that was, and I was really conscious the whole time of going, pull back, don't be too ridiculous, don't be too, do not turn this into, sort of into kind of an essay, which is really difficult because I mean, obviously, it is political, but I hope it's not preachy. Like, I think that there are, like I hope it's something where you could read it and you could think, oh, but that's still, sort of a wrong decision that you have made there, young lady, and not to sort of feel as though the book is saying at every point, no, this is like right and good, and this is the proper way to think about it.
So, slightly paraphrasing the press release and the jacket note, and not wanting to give every bit of the... It's up to you how much the plot you want to give away, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
I'll kind of leave that up to you. But it's a book about the right to choose whether to have an abortion or not in the context of transgender issues?
I wouldn't say necessarily that. I think it was more... I'm very interested in sort of in the body, and particularly hating the body. So I think sort of it seemed like it would be very difficult to write about what it means to be a woman with kind of female anatomy and not kind of acknowledge the fact that there are people that would identify as women without having that anatomy, or that, you could have that anatomy but identify as male or non-binary or whatever it might be. So it did kind of feel like it would have been weird to just go, oh, it is terrible being a woman, without looking at how we define that and how we sort of... plus like it does make for interesting tensions there, and I think it is part of the reason, because I was also thinking about reasons why Lauren, the main character, would have difficulty talking to her friends about the choice that she must face. Guys, it's a novel about abortion, okay? It's not subtle. It's a we need to repeal the 8th Amendment novel, basically. But
and what brought you to this? Like, when did you realise that this was what the book was about, was going to be about? What was your process? Was there a moment where you went, that's it, I'm doing a book about this? Or had you started writing it and realised it was about it? Like, what was the...
So I wrote... I basically sort of in my head, I was kind of conscious of the fact that young adult literature rarely, in actually a lot of media in general, does not feature characters actually having abortions. It will, they will like, or if they do for dramatic purposes, they will then feel guilty about it, or something will go wrong. But generally, it is presented as like kind of not an option, or sort of like, or else, oh, they will like maybe like schedule one, but then they will have sort of like a miscarriage very conveniently for the plot, or they will go through with a pregnancy and then give up a child for adoption, and it does kind of...
They fudge it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's relatively recent that we have seen, sort of... and there's also a lot of misinformation about abortion, which I do rant about in the novel as well, through kind of one of the other characters. But one of the moments that I note is... in the first season finale of House of Cards, where one of the characters is kind of, is told that she's got, it's going to be very difficult for her to get pregnant, and the doctor, and it's like, is it because I've had abortions? And the doctor says yes, and it's like, that's just like medical misinformation, like if you have had a safe abortion, as opposed to like, back alleys and, infections and all this kind of stuff, it has no impact on your fertility. And like to just kind of present this very kind of damaging myth, and just to sort of to have it as fact, I was outraged, and I know that there's other things that happen in that episode, but I don't even remember them because I was just sitting there like seething.
And was this before you decided to write the book?
Yeah. I mean, it's always been something that I've been conscious of. And
so House of Cards kind of pushed you over the edge to write it?
It wasn't even that. I mean, it's always been something that, it's always been something that I've been kind of aware of, and then, I think ever since, Savita's death in 2012, like, it has been something that... 2012, 5 years on, we are still dealing with this nonsense.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and like, it just seems like sort of every so often there's like another kind of horrific story, and it's like, when are we going to, it is ridiculous, and it's absolutely mad. And I was like, I wanted to write about it, but I knew that there would have to be kind of another element in there, and I wasn't sure what that was going to be. And then 2 years ago, I basically put together a synopsis for this. Because it was the second book in a 2-book contract, so it was kind of like, okay, put something together and we'll see if we can kind of like, give that the kind of the thumbs up for your second book. And I was like, ooh, okay, so you could have, because I was thinking about like, okay, so I mean, writing just about like, reproductive choice would be very tedious and would turn it into a, like a sort of a polemic. So I was like, okay, school musicals. I've also always wanted to write about a school musical, so I'm going to, how do I smush these things together? And I think for me, like figuring out, like, I think so much of like thinking about a novel is like, what are you going to kind of smush together to make into a new thing? Like I think
You're
when
quite Machiavellian, you're like this puppet master. Sorry, so you smush a musical and reproductive choices.
Yeah. And sort of, and I also wanted to write about, sort of the kind of groups of friends that you have that kind of aren't in school, and that sort of, and how intense those can be. So like Lauren is also, she's a member of a LGBTQ kind of support group type thing, which kind of gives her kind of access to like these, sort of, I mean, the kind of teenagers that you're talking about who are kind of very socially aware and very, sort of opinionated and very kind of firm on like, here are like sort of, here are all the right things and, here's kind of where we're coming from, and to kind of juxtapose that with, sort of teenagers who kind of aren't actually that aware and aren't that interested and, are just kind of...
What is the breakdown, do you think, in terms of Repeal the Eighth, in terms of breakdown of teenagers, in terms of those that are for, those that are against, those that aren't interested? Like, what's your experience in terms of the general mood?
I think it really depends. Like I'm very conscious that, like, okay, so the kind of teenagers that like I will interact with, say like in a workshop kind of outside of school where they've chosen to be there, like they're pretty much going to be, like your pro-choice, liberal, sort of everything. And then, if you go into a school, the responses might be sort of quite different and much more mixed. And then, I mean, it depends as well in terms of like, city versus country and, sort of like, I think economic class as well. Like there's a whole lot of factors that
But is it kind of like Brexit or Corbyn in the UK that like everyone under a certain age thinks one thing, everyone over a certain age thinks another thing, or it's not that cut and dried?
I don't think it is at all. No, I think there's...
I mean, not that you're even an expert on what people think about abortion because you've written a book about it. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I did, like, I do, it is something that I read an awful lot about, because, the other thing about, like, sort of my writing process, if you like, is that I kind of do what I call like passive research. So it's like, I find it very difficult to actually set out and be like, okay, I now need to read like all these books about this thing. I'd much prefer to go, ooh, what have I read a lot about already? And how can I use that, instead of working through it that way. I mean, I think, I think a lot of older people as well are, sort of just going like, this is absolutely ridiculous,
Were you intimidated when you were thinking of whether to do this book or not by the fire you would draw upon yourself by writing a book like this, and did that fire come? I mean, if anyone tweets anything pro-abortion, just a hailstorm of people jump on top of you and start kicking the crap out of you. I mean, you obviously would have been aware of that.
Yeah.
So what was that process like for you, and what has the reaction from those? It's like this culture war thing.
Yeah.
So did that daunt you? Did that intimidate you? And
no, because I had been in the position of sort of tweeting pro-choice stuff on Twitter like well before writing the book, and had this sort of like a lot of middle-aged, very Christian men from America kind of jumping on it, and sort of clearly kind of just spending their days like searching for certain hashtags that they could like argue with strangers, and now I think actually a lot of that has stopped, because I think so many people are talking about, abortion and abortion rights. So I don't get a huge amount of it anymore. Either I've just, managed to block like every single like creepy anti-choicer out there.
How many people do you think you've blocked?
It's in the hundreds.
So, because the thing about culture wars, and the fact that this interview is going out on as a podcast and not on RT in this case means it doesn't have to be balanced.
I'm doing the quote marks here.
but the whole reason, when they were bringing balance in, it was for democratic reasons. They didn't want the airwaves to be controlled by one viewpoint or another. Yeah. But it really feels to me, number one, that our civil marriage referendum was actually about abortion. And I think the anti-abortion people were using it as a dry run. They never thought they would win the civil marriage referendum and have it turned down. But the amount of airtime they got for abortion off the back of the civil marriage referendum, I thought was disgusting.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've learned kind of just to, because I would kind of get very, very outraged and angry and all the rest. So like at this point I'm just kind of like, no, don't do it to yourself. Like there's, like I used to sort of reading, Bríd O'Brien stuff in the Irish Times, and just like sort of, I'd be like in a tizzy for the rest of the day, and it's like, why are you doing this to yourself? Like, you don't even need to read her stuff to know that it's going to be absolute nonsense, and that it is going to be kind of misleading, and it's going to be, just gross stuff, and the number of people, like I find it really weird, the number of men that are really interested in like women's wombs. Like there's something really weird about that, like sort of, priests going like, oh well, and it's like, you don't know the first thing about the reproductive system, like, would you like a chat about it, would you? They don't have a clue. And like, there's like, and all this kind of stuff about, but sort of life begins at conception and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, do you know how many early miscarriages people have? But sometimes they don't know about them because they just think it's a heavy period. Yes, I said period, father.
And then on the one side, so we have the fake balance thing, and all this and minority really leveraging that balance to try and shape the national discussion. But then on the other hand, and the other extreme of that is when you've blocked all the people you disagree with, you end up in this echo chamber. So, I mean, not just in terms of reproductive rights, in terms of lots of other stuff going on in the world, whether the environment or Trump or, resource allocation. How do we strike that balance between engaging with people we don't agree with and shutting off the loons? How do you walk that line?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm sort of bewildered by people that seem to think that, like, if you're getting all of your news and information from Twitter, there's something very wrong with you. You know, like, I do not see it as, like, you know, sort of a forum for, like, getting all my political education, you know, and I think that anyone who does that is very, very foolish. I see it more as, you know, like we would never kind of sort of say to people, oh, well, you know, you must, like, you know, it's important, like, you know, that you have, like, a racist among your friends, you know, for balance. Like, and I mean, I think that's what it is. It's like, you know, you can be aware of what other views, you know, people have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to invite them to dinner, you know?
That's brilliant. But how do we construct that then? Like, how do we as a society make sure that we don't shut out dissenting voices whilst at the same time not having a racist friend for the sake of it? Like how, I worry about that. I worry about, like, if everyone blocks down into their own silo and only engage with people they agree with, how will we ever progress? Because there's lots of things I believe that I used to believe in.
Yeah.
There's lots of, you know, and there's a process.
Absolutely. I think that, but I mean, I think there is a kind of sort of confusion over, you know, like, you know, I do think in the media, you know, obviously you should have sort of a range of voices, but at the same time, I suppose it is often kind of subjective as to, like, what is kind of like a considered, you know, sort of alternate opinion and what is just, you know, hate-mongering nonsense. And I mean, that is, you know, that is so often in the eye of the beholder. You know, it's a very difficult line to draw. You know, I mean, there are people that, I mean, you know, there are people that sort of, like, would say that, I don't know, you can't, like, you know, you should have, you shouldn't even say, like, sort of, you know, I don't know, like black people or, like, sort of white people or, like, sort of, you know, anything like that, or, you know, you must, before saying anything, you must preface it with, you know, straight, cis, able-bodied, white, middle class, and it's like, that's, you know, and that if you haven't done that in some way, that you are a terrible human and must be silenced, you know. So I think it is a difficult one.
How will we find it? But for the benefit of listeners outside of Ireland, we've been talking about repeal the eighth and the eighth. Irish people know what it means. Can you just give a quick heads up to people leading international listening, well, like the weather report from Ireland? What is the repeal the eighth movement? Here
in lovely Ireland, where we managed to be quite progressive about some things, like same-sex marriage, like, you know, transgender recognition, you know, a whole bunch of other things. We still, however, have this unfortunate tendency to treat women like vessels when it comes to pregnancy. So the Repeal the Eighth movement refers to a campaign against the Eighth Amendment of our Constitution, which basically says that a woman is, you know, sort of has the same right to life as her unborn child, regardless of, you know, sort of like what stage the pregnancy might be at, or, you know, sort of anything like that, without, you know, sort of recognition of, you know, sort of any health issues that she might have. There has been kind of a slight sort of tweak to that, which says that if a woman's life is at risk, then it might be okay. This was like considered, you know, groundbreaking, the idea that we might not let women die, and it came into place after a woman died because she could not get an abortion, and was told in an amazingly quotable moment by one of the nurses, well, this is a Catholic country.
And this was five years ago. So what's happening now? What's happening next? What's your predictions?
Well, I'm hoping that the promised referendum on the issue will actually happen. I mean, I think it will. I think that you know, like there was the delaying tactic with having a citizens' assembly discuss kind of the various issues, and you know that was, I mean, I think sort of a delaying exercise that unfortunately backfired when it turned out that if you actually educate regular people about abortion in a sort of in an honest way, they actually want quite liberal access to it.
And then the government quashed the findings of that thing. Is it fair to say, and to me, the Repeal the Eighth campaign feels like a movement.
Yeah.
And it's mainly a feminist movement, but not exclusively, but it feels like a movement. and repeal the 8th happens to be what Irish women have galvanised around. Do you think that's a fair?
I think so, yeah. I think that, I think that it has just, I mean, it's been, the amendment has been in place for 34 years at this point. So it's obviously not a new issue, but I think, when you have kind of a few incidents that remind you of just how kind of dire the situation really is, it does just kind of sort of get the ball rolling. I think it will be interesting. There's kind of sometimes kind of criticism and sort of tone policing of the movement and all that. But I think at this point it's kind of it's sort of the campaign is to actually get rid of it, have a referendum. I think once that is actually established, I think that the tone is going to sort of shift, and it is going to be sort of very, very pragmatic.
And in the middle of all this, you release your 12th young adult fiction novel, Like Other Girls, which confronts all this head on.
Yeah.
And what's the reaction been? It's out about a month.
Yeah, it's a month tomorrow. It's been mostly positive. I haven't had anybody tell me that I'm going to hell for writing about abortion, and I'm really disappointed by that.
You have failed.
How am I sort of doing in life if no one is telling me to burn in hell?
You've blocked too many people. Can you unblock a few of the worst just so you get that rush? Oh yeah. They don't know my book exists. Oh.
That was it. Yeah.
So have people? Has it crossed over because of the subject matter? I think that generally sort of YA fiction it feels kind of more acceptable to read it as an adult in recent years. I think people are kind of conscious that there's a lot of good writing there, and that you're allowed to read it and it's okay even if you are an adult. Because as soon as I read about your book, I was like, man. And I knew the show was going on summer holidays from RT, where we keep going on podcasts and RT play repeats. And I was like, I want this to be the first show once we diverge into our, because I can't imagine actually, even though I think most of what we said is pretty balanced, I can't imagine trying to do this interview in that context. And has that been an issue for you in terms of promoting the book? Are you a hot potato as a result?
Not really, no. I think that, I think that maybe a couple of years ago, would have been sort of a much bigger deal, I suppose. But there are so many, I think there has been kind of, so much discussion about the repeal movement that it's kind of, you kind of presume that most women in Ireland are pro-choice, which they are, and a lot of the ones that sort of don't realise that they are sort of I personally would never have an abortion. It's but do you care what other people do? No. Aha! Pro-choice, we've got you. Come over to our side. And I think most people are really, it is a handful of lunatics that are overly invested in, sort of in telling other people what they can and cannot do with their bodies. If they look, if you've got 10 or 12 women a day sort of leaving, if you genuinely thought that they were going off to murder a baby, you would be picketing the airports. You would be demanding pregnancy tests for women traveling. If you really thought that it was murder, you'd be doing that, wouldn't you?
I think it's amazing to be able to be doing an interview about abortion and laughing, and I mean that in a proper way. I don't mean
absolutely, yeah. But I think that I'm a big.
I love the way you're bringing humour into it. It is brilliant.
I'm a huge fan of I can't do solemn, I can't do serious. I can for maybe 5 minutes, and then it's no, bring in the humour. And I think that's really important. Even if it's quite black humour.
So, the fact that this book is out a month how far are you into your next book? Has your option been picked up? You fulfilled your 2-book deal. Like, what's next? Are you?
So I'm at the very early stages of another young adult project. Yeah.
That sounds like a tight-lipped comment. That's what I would call kicking for touch. I'm at the very early stages, haven't signed a book deal yet. It's a bit too soon for me to be spilling the beans.
It's very soon. Yeah. I think ideally I would have liked to have kind of started it before the book came out, but the timeline on this was kind of quite tight. So we were doing kind of like copy edits and sort of, you know, like going through the kind of the proofs, which is like where you sort of realise that you can't use commas or semicolons, and you know, I also have the proofreader is very British, so like we'll sometimes sort of circle things and go, question mark, what is this? One of the changes was, I think, changing a bit of dialogue from "you're one" to "the one," and I was like, how dare you? I mean, you know, you with your British imperialist ways.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. Your Twitter is Claire Hennessy Books.
C Hennessy Books.
Sorry, C Hennessy Books on Twitter. I really recommend you follow Claire. A constant stream of entertainment of all sorts, guaranteed, without the price of admission for a book even. This has been Born Optimistic, and I've been sharing the microphone with Claire Hennessy. And thank you, Claire,
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
And until next Monday on the podcast, iTunes, Stitcher world. And thanks to everyone who made the show possible. I'm not going to get into the thank yous right now. I'm just going to say, talk to you next Monday. Thank you. Bye.